Now, before we get to the Gospels, let me take a quick look at 1 Corinthians 1. So Paul wrote this letter because he was informed about massive internal quarreling, what he calls eris, okay, eris, which was also the name of the Greek god of strife. Eris in Arabic is ikhtilaf. Paul wrote, this is in 1 Corinthians 1:12, some of you say, I am of Paul, i.e. follow Paul. Others say, I am of Apollos, or I am of Kepha, Peter, or I am of Christ. So this verse is very strange. This is, did I quote this? Yeah, 1 Corinthians, so this is 1 Corinthians 1:12. It's very strange and has been notoriously difficult to make sense of throughout the centuries. So it seems that Paul was told by certain, it seems that Paul was told that certain competing factions had arisen in Corinth and that each faction championed its own teacher as authentically teaching the gospel, right? Thus, the followers of Peter disagreed with those of Paul, and both disagreed with those of Apollos. But what was the nature of their ikhtilafat, of their disagreements? And what are we to make of those who disagreed with Paul, Apollos, and Peter and preferred to follow Christ? Now, Paul goes on to say, in essence, that we should all follow Christ, right? He says, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified? But what Paul really meant was that the Corinthians should follow Christ by following him, Paul. And this is what he says later explicitly, follow me because I follow Christ. In Philippians 3:17, he says, brothers and sisters, join in following me. He tells the Corinthians, if you are not married, follow me, just be celibate, right? The world's about to end anyway. What we do know is that Paul reprimanded the Corinthians that when he first came to them, he did not try to speak with impressive speech or wise arguments, he says, but only to present Jesus Christ and him crucified. So Paul is saying that he could have sort of philosophically elaborated upon his teachings, but at the bare minimum, the Corinthians must believe that Jesus, the Messiah, was crucified. If you don't believe that, you don't believe in my gospel, right? So in 1 Corinthians 1, it is very likely that the crucifixion of Jesus was the main cause of the dissension, the eris among the different factions, with some even rejecting Christ altogether because of it. Perhaps some of the Corinthians were influenced by the prevalent Jewish understanding and some by a philosophical Greek understanding, because Paul stated, but we preach Christ crucified, an impediment unto the Jews and an absurdity unto the Greeks. That is, for the Jews, the idea of the sort of long-awaited Davidic King Messiah being crucified was an oxymoronic scandalon. While for the Greek wise men, i.e. philosophers, the notion of a literal God dying for our sins was morion, nonsense. Only uneducated fools believed in the literalness of such mythology, as Celsus once pointed out. So Paul did not know the exact extent of the quarreling among the Corinthian factions, but only that it had something to do with his original pronouncement to them that Christ was crucified and that Peter's name was thrown into the mix. Okay, Paul wanted his congregation to rest assured that he and Peter, and James for that matter, were on the same wavelength about the crucifixion, despite what they may have heard to the contrary. It is possible that when Paul stated that the crucifixion of Christ was an impediment or stumbling block to the Jews, by Jew, he meant both non-Christian Jews as well as Jewish Christians. This is possible because he refers to Peter as a Jew in Galatians. Maybe the faction of Peter in Corinth denied Jesus's crucifixion. Again, Paul is the indirect author of the Gospels. This is a really important point, that Paul is the indirect author of the Gospels. In Mark, why does the Markan Jesus, really the Pauline Jesus, that's really who it is, why does the Markan Jesus refer to Peter as Satan? Well, Jesus, in quotes, says that he will suffer, be rejected, and be killed. When Peter heard this, he took Jesus aside and started rebuking him. So then the Markan Jesus shouted, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on earthly things." Now, What does Paul say about his opponents in Philippians 3? He calls them dogs who mutilate the flesh. So these are Jewish Christians who practice circumcision. Then he calls them enemies of the cross, who, quote, set their minds on earthly things. What did, quote, Jesus say to Peter in Mark 8:33? He said that he was setting his mind on earthly things. The Markan, aka Pauline Jesus, calls Peter Satan for objecting to Jesus being killed and says his mind is set on earthly things. Paul calls his opponents in Philippians enemies of the cross and says their minds are set on earthly things. It is plausible that there were followers of Peter in Paul's day who opposed Paul's notion that Jesus was killed. I think Mark is well aware during his time that there were Jewish Christians who claimed sanad, they claimed a link to Peter, and denied the crucifixion. This is why the Markan Jesus called Peter Satan, because Paul called the followers of Peter enemies of the cross 20 years earlier for plausibly denying that Jesus was killed. Now, whatever the disputes actually entailed, we will sadly never know for certain. We do know, however, that eventually Jewish Christian apostles, with letters of authorization from James, visited Corinth and preached another Jesus unto the Corinthians that diametrically opposed Paul's teachings. So to me, it seems that James was informed that Paul was throwing his good name around to bolster the authority of his own deviant gospel. By the end of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he warns the Corinthians that if they continue seeking proof that Christ genuinely speaks through him, in other words, if they keep questioning Paul's authority and legitimacy, Paul will confront them harshly and they will be punished by Christ. He tells them to not be deceived by a seemingly weak Christ hanging on the cross. Christ will demonstrate his power when he judges them. So it is historically plausible that there were factions of Christians living in Galatia and Corinth and Philippi who repudiated the crucifixion altogether. Yes, it is also plausible that these Christians were persuaded by Jewish Christians who were teaching another gospel and another Jesus compared to what Paul was teaching. They were teaching an uncrucified Jesus. This is totally plausible.